I'm Katie Doyle Myers, the Executive Director of the Desmoid Tumor Research Foundation. Welcome. We're so glad you're here. I'm just going to give it one moment to let folks come in. I hope everyone's doing well and safe from the heat. And again, we so appreciate you being here with us this evening. In one moment, I'm going to introduce our special guest, Dr. Chug. But first and foremost, I just want to welcome you once again to this evening webinar about the RINGSIDE trial results for varegacestat, which is a medical treatment for desmoid tumors. We want to be able to share with you the data as well as what those results mean for you and your loved ones. Thank you to our sponsor, Immunome Inc., for their support for this educational webinar. Please note that this webinar is intended solely for educational purposes. The DTRF does not endorse any specific treatments or studies. So again, welcome if you're just jumping on, and we want you to know how excited we are for this conversation with Dr. Chug this evening. I am going to get to a formal introduction of Dr. Chug and then pass along to her so she can give you her presentation. But before we do that, I wanted to acknowledge some questions we've received, specifically wondering when this particular medical therapy, varegacestat, might become available and what the FDA approval process looks like. So back in May, Immunome announced that it had submitted its new drug approval, which is also known as an NDA, to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. So this is for varegacestat, a once daily oral gamma secretase inhibitor that is being studied for adults living with desmoid tumors. This was a really important milestone for our community. While it doesn't mean that the drug has been approved, it does reflect years of research and clinical investigation and marks another significant step forward in bringing potential treatment options to people living with desmoid tumors. So what's happening now and what's happening next? So as of last week, the FDA has accepted the application for formal review. This means that now the FDA will complete a comprehensive evaluation of the therapy's safety, effectiveness, and manufacturing quality. So this is a time when the FDA may conduct facility inspections, they may convene an independent advisory committee to review the data, etc. The date that the FDA is expected to provide notification about this process is on or before April 28th, 2027. So we at the DTRF will continue to keep this community informed as we learn about progress. Today's webinar is not about the regulatory review itself, but rather about understanding the data that led us to this point. So on that note, where are we going this evening? Dr. Chug is going to walk us through the RINGSIDE trial results, explaining what the findings mean in practical terms and to help us better understand how varegacestat may fit into the evolving treatment landscape for our rare disease. We do have time reserved for questions at the end of today's session, and we're going to do our best to address both the scientific findings and the broader questions you may have. I do want to take a moment and say thank you so much to the folks who have registered for this webinar and already submitted questions, as well as to questions that we've received from the broader desmoid community. Please know that we've reviewed each and every question, and we will do our very best to address as many as possible today. Dr. Chug is actually trying to weave in responses to your questions into her presentation. Unfortunately, we won't be able to address every specific unique desmoid case. If you have questions that are not able to be answered in this webinar today, you are more than welcome to reach out to us at info@dtrf.org, and we will respond to the best of our ability with appropriate resources. Okay, so just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. The Q&A, the Zoom Q&A, is open. Please write questions to Dr. Chug there. We will be monitoring the Q&A, and again, our hope is that many of them are addressed within Dr. Chug's presentation, but we will have time at the end of her presentation for additional questions as they arise. The chat function, the Zoom chat function, will also be on for you to communicate with one another. It will not be monitored for questions during this session, but you are more than welcome to network with one another there, and we encourage you to do so. Finally, if you know someone who wanted to join this webinar, but they weren't able to, please tell them that this recording will live on the DTRF's video library on our website, and we will notify the community when it's public, which is very soon, just in a couple weeks. So be sure to subscribe to our newsletter as well for those types of notifications. All right, thanks for listening. And at this time, I'm so pleased to introduce you to our special guest, Dr. Rashmi Chugh. Dr. Chugh is one of the DTRF's medical advisors, and I'm so grateful for her. And she serves as a professor of internal medicine at the Division of Hematology Oncology at the University of Michigan Rogel Comprehensive Cancer Center. She is also the Associate Division Chief of Clinical Services of Hematology Oncology and Sarcoma Clinical Research Team co-leader. Dr. Chugh's clinical practice is focused on the care of patients with bone and soft tissue sarcoma and desmoid fibromatosis. Her research involves conducting early and late phase clinical trials of novel therapies alone or in combination with a goal to advance the care of sarcoma and desmoid patients. She also has a particular interest in the care and research surrounding the adolescent and young adult population and understanding the unique challenges they face. Thank you, Dr. Chugh, for taking the time to join us this evening, and I'm passing along to you now for your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Katie, for that kind introduction and for framing this discussion about this new exciting drug therapy. And I would like to give a shout right back out to Katie and the team at DTRF for putting this together. Really has just been a pleasure ever since she started as kind of our latest lead for DTRF.
Thanks, Rashmi.
So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. Everything good?
Yep, looks great.
So yes, we are going to be talking today about the RINGSIDE trial. So this is the RINGSIDE trial of varegacestat, which is a gamma secretase inhibitor. And we're going to go over some details there and what it means for you all, the desmoid community, which you are near and dear to my heart for sure. So before we get started, I'm going to just go over my disclosures. And this just are a list of study, mostly research funding that I have, but I do want to let you all know that I have participated both in the varegacestat study as well as the nirogacestat study and any new treatments for desmoid tumor patients I can get my hands on. But that does not, I think does not affect my ability to be neutral and kind of present the data to you all. So we're going to start with just talking about the basics of desmoid tumors. I know a lot of you are experts and a lot of you are maybe newbies to this area. So forgive me if I go too fast or too slow, but I want to make sure I kind of address things so everybody can hopefully get a little understanding. We are going to talk a little bit about the biology behind desmoid tumors because we want to be able to share how gamma secretase inhibitors work. And then we're going to spend some time talking about the RINGSIDE study of varegacestat. This was just recently presented at our big national oncology meeting in June of 2026. So a lot of this data is hot off the presses, but it hasn't been formally published in a journal yet. So we have, we don't have all the data to present, just the ones that are publicly available. And we are going to do a little bit of a comparison and a summary. And then, as Katie said, we'll have some time for Q&A. So there is going to be lots of information. So some of the slides are busy and are overwhelming. So if it seems overwhelming, I tried to put a little bit area right at the bottom in a white box that gives us the bottom lines and hopefully summarizes it for those who I lose in some of the discussion. So, as you all know, desmoid tumors are known by many names, and it can be confusing at first. So, desmoid fibromatosis, aggressive fibromatosis, all the same thing. And these are rare proliferations, so rare kind of groups of fibrous cells that basically form unchallenged and keep growing, as opposed to other tumors that often just kind of stay better contained. They are rare and affect only about 2 to 4 per million people. Although I kind of feel like there's more people out there, and we're just starting to understand and recognize the disease more. We know that there's a very variable way these behave. They can occur anywhere in the body, from the neck to the arm to the back to the belly. And they can be associated with a genetic condition called familial adenomatous polyposis. In a small number of patients, it can be associated with trauma or pregnancy, or most commonly associated with nothing at all that we can figure it out. They just kind of happen sometimes, and we call those sporadic. Um, so I love to put up this slide to just kind of represent that desmoid tumors are just so heterogeneous. There's a whole spectrum of behavior of desmoid tumors, so kind of ranging from just being quiet, or what I like to say in hibernation, where they're there, but they're not really doing anything, causing problems, to that they can be symptomatic, where they cause some symptoms, but they're mild, or their symptoms can be life altering and affect what you do on a daily basis. And very rarely they can be a life threatening condition where they're just in a really tough spot. Likewise, there's a whole spectrum of desmoid therapies, and at any given time, one or the other may be indicated. So, kind of starting with observation, there are different times where the desmoid tumors may not be causing a lot of problems and might be in a quieter state. And so, sometimes it's very reasonable to just observe them. Not as much anymore, but we've used anti-inflammatories and anti-hormone therapies in the past. And there's also a number of targeted treatments. And cytotoxics are what most people think about as chemotherapy as treatment options. And then there's a number of local therapies. Now, we've learned that surgery is usually not the best option, but there's also some ablative treatments as well as radiation. So this is kind of a whole spectrum of disease with a whole spectrum of therapies. So, um, so every desmoid is different. Treatments have to be tailored to the individual patient as well as tumor. So now let's jump in to a really super busy slide. So my apologies, and I will disclose I did generate this with the use of AI. But what makes desmoid tumors tick? Why are they there? So this is, again, a lot of information, but what we know about desmoid tumors is probably just the tip of the iceberg. So we know that desmoid tumors are really driven by this specialized growth pathway called the Wnt pathway. And this is involved in repair and growth of normal tissues. But in desmoid tumors, there's kind of this abnormal regulation of this pathway. And we know that that's the case because one of the genes in the pathway is called beta-catenin. You may or may not have heard of this, but the majority of patients that have desmoid tumors have a genetic change or a mutation in beta-catenin. The ones where they are inherited in familial adenomatous polyposis have a different mutation in that same pathway called APC. So we know that in a normal cell that's just resting, that's doing okay, not growing, not injured, this Wnt pathway is off. It's not causing any problems. It just exists to be turned on in case there's a problem. But when cells get injured, somehow this Wnt pathway is turned on, and that leads to kind of this buildup of beta-catenin just in the normal cell, and it targets genes on to help with repair and healing, normal wounds, normal scars. It relies on this. But with a desmoid tumor, this pathway is uncontrolled, and we get buildup of this gene, of this protein called beta-catenin. And that protein causes this continuously active repair state, and that's how we have uncontrolled growth of the desmoid tumor. So, phew, I know that was a lot. I will kind of to boil that down. Desmoid tumors, they're governed by specific growth pathways, and the main one is called Wnt. So what do we do about it? So, and how does this relate to this study I'm here to talk about, right? So So gamma secretase inhibitors in desmoid tumors don't block the Wnt pathway, but we know that the Wnt pathway doesn't act alone. The body is complicated. So the Wnt pathway talks with another pathway in the cell called the Notch pathway. And we know that gamma secretase inhibitors, or GSIs, which include varegacestat that we're going to talk about and nirogacestat, they block these signals in the Notch pathway, and that can affect growth. So in a desmoid tumor, this Wnt pathway is on, as we just talked about, and kind of on in an uncontrolled way, as opposed to the normal healing way. But then this Notch pathway talks together with this Wnt pathway. The GSIs block this Notch pathway, and that helps to slow down desmoid tumor growth. So it's kind of a little bit what we call hand wavy. We don't know all of the details, but this is how we believe these drugs are working in your system. Nirogacestat is the first drug, period, but is the first GSI that was approved for desmoid tumors. And then to get to my summary, GSIs block this pathway, Notch, that crosstalks with the desmoid tumor growth pathways, Wnt. And again, we're still trying to understand the details of how this all works. So now let's get to what you're here to talk about, the RINGSIDE trial. So this was a study that was presented at our national meeting. And just so you know, I borrowed these slides direct from our presenters that we were kind of all part of the team that participated in the study presented by Dr. Gounder. So some of these slides are a little overwhelming or a little bit more meant for the medical community, but we're going to walk through them. So essentially, the study consisted of patients that had desmoid tumors that we know were growing. So we know that oftentimes if the desmoid tumors are in that sleepy hibernation state and are not growing, they don't necessarily need treatment. So this was our way to select for patients that that would benefit from treatment by showing that it had grown in the last 12 months. Patients where the tumor had grown were randomly assigned either to the GSI varegacestat, which was given once daily, or to a placebo. So we know that some patients' tumors shrink on their own, so it's felt reasonable, at least at the time of this study, to give a placebo. And at the time this study started, nirogacestat was not approved. And then we looked at how patients did, whether they got the varegacestat or whether they received the placebo. So let's see how they did. So this was the outcome, probably the most important part of the study. And every study has what we call a primary endpoint, or kind of a goal that we look for to show that we think that the treatment is helping. So the main study endpoint was something called progression-free survival. So we know these tumors were progressing in patients before we got started. So this is a graph that shows the percentage of patients who progressed at the start of the study, 100% to 0%. And then this is the number of months they started on study. So right at time 0, we were saying, gosh, that's the baseline. And then over time, we looked at how many patients were progressing at different time points. And as you can see, this orange line with varegacestat showed that, gosh, while there were some patients whose tumors progressed on study, so, started out as, 100% were progression-free, eventually there were some patients that had their tumors progress on study, but it was a lot less than those that just had placebo. So, looking at all of these numbers, essentially the study goal was met. Fewer patients had tumors that progressed with varegacestat as compared to placebo. So this was felt to be a successful study by the fact that, gosh, at the time that the study data was available, we hadn't even reached the point where half of the patients had tumors that progressed. And after about 2 years, patients on placebo had progression of their disease. And just so you know, progression was defined in a very specific way, not just progression of your symptoms, that was hurting a little bit or it grew a couple millimeters. It was that it had progressed by a certain measure we used, where over 20% of the longest size of the tumor had grown. Um, so, what else did we learn from this treatment? So, we also know that there was not just a lack of growth, but there was actually tumor shrinkage. So, that is called the objective response rate. And that just means that when we looked at scans, usually MRI scans, that there was significant tumor shrinkage. And the way that we define it in the clinical trials world is over 30% tumor shrinkage of that largest dimension. Over 55% of patients with varegacestat met our threshold of significant tumor shrinkage. So these are a few graphs that we call waterfall plots. So it looks at the percentage change of the tumor size. And we start at 0. So if the tumor didn't change at all, the bar would be right here. But if the tumor grew at all, the biggest change would be up here. And if it shrank, the biggest change would be down here. So you can see there were some patients' tumors who shrank 100%, so actually disappeared on this treatment. And there was a large number of patients whose tumor shrank. The ones in blue met that threshold for significant shrinkage, and that was 55%. And then there was other patients who had mild shrinkage, so all below the 0% range. I will say that on placebo, there was also some patients who had significant tumor shrinkage. So, when we talk about observing for a while, we know that some people can do well with that. There was even one patient whose tumor completely shrank down. And then there was others that had significant shrinkage, but gosh, nowhere near to the number of patients that were treated with varegacestat. So 9% of tumors shrank significantly with placebo as opposed to 55% with varegacestat. We also learned a lot about the side effects, and we'll go over a little bit more detail when we do a comparison. But we know that the side effects were pretty comparable to other GSIs, specifically nirogacestat. So the most common ones are diarrhea. So people with any diarrhea was about 80%. But when we talk about study speak, grade 3 diarrhea is where it's pretty significant, really kind of can be pretty tough. So only about 10% had really tough diarrhea. And usually when side effects are this tough, we end up needing to hold and reduce the dose. Fatigue was in almost half of the patients. And sometimes it was pretty significant fatigue, but not often. And then rash occurred in about 40% of patients. And again, not as significant in too many patients. We also know that patients that are childbearing or premenopausal can have what we call ovarian toxicity. And that just means that the hormones, ovarian hormones, can be effective and cause things like hot flashes or for people to lose their periods. Most of the time, that appears to be temporary, but we always counsel our patients that, you know what, we're still learning. These drugs are still relatively new. So we don't know for sure if your period's going to come back, if hot flashes are going to go away. But we know compared to placebo, about over half of patients that were premenopausal had some signs that their ovarian hormones were affected. And even while they're on study and oftentimes still on treatment, over half of them resolved who reported it. And I expect that these are kind of going to improve as we get more follow-up data. We also did a lot of evaluations of quality of life, things like pain and mobility and, overall quality. Those improved in multiple areas with varegacestat and compared to placebo. So to kind of summarize, tumors shrank more often and more profoundly with varegacestat as compared to placebo. The next study slide I wanted to show you is that you may be wondering, well, of all that we talked about how desmoid tumors are very heterogeneous. Gosh, who benefited more than others? Well, gosh, they looked at a number of different qualities, ranging from whether you're male or female, if you're young or old, where the desmoid tumor was, what type of genetic change in your tumor was, how big it was. And compared to placebo, varegacestat really showed benefit across all of the groups that were tested. And this is kind of another type of study plot that we look at, and it shows that, gosh, if it falls on this end of that dotted line, it favored varegacestat patients doing better. And on this side, it favored the placebo. So really, all these different types of patients seem to benefit from varegacestat as compared to placebo. And so, yes, that's my summary statement. Helped all types of patients with desmoid tumors who were evaluated. So I really bet you're wondering, well, gosh, how does this compare to other therapies? And so it's really important for me to talk to you right now is that even though we have two drugs that are very similar and two study designs that were very similar, we can't directly compare studies against one another. If we have if we had a study of varegacestat, which was kind of the one we're talking about now, compared to nirogacestat, which was the drug that's already approved, if we had them head to head, it would be easier to compare. But we know that when we have two whole different studies, there are some subtle differences between the patients. We know that there are different eras of treatments. Varegacestat study was a little bit later than the nirogacestat study. We had learned different things about nirogacestat, in this class of drugs that we knew by the time the RINGSIDE study was done. And we also know that there's, some different subtleties in measurements of quality of life, different measurements in how the tumors are measured. There's a lot of different subtleties that we can't always take into account when there's two different studies. With that being said, we can make some really broad and general comparisons just so you guys can feel a little bit informed. And I think that that's why you're on the webinar right now, just so you can kind of learn, gosh, what is the difference between this and that? So this is the schematic of the DeFi study. So this was a couple years back when this was presented, also by Dr. Gounder. And you can see this looks really familiar. So a lot of folks that studied the nirogacestat treatment also study the varegacestat. So, the two studies have a lot of similarities and a lot of the same folks that were involved. And similarly, it took patients that had tumors that were growing, and these patients were given nirogacestat, and the way that's given is twice daily, and they were compared to placebo twice daily. So we know that when we put these pictures together, so you guys, hopefully you remember from a couple slides back, this waterfall plot where we look and see how much these tumors have shrunk down below baseline. And you can see this was varegacestat, where there is a lot of tumor shrinkage and a lot of significant tumor shrinkage. And then this is the placebo. This is I swapped this out a little bit on you guys. This is the volume, not just the tumor size. So there's different ways we can measure this. But you can see just really generally when you compare it to the DeFi study or the nirogacestat drug, gosh, it seems like there is a lot more kind of below the line, a lot more shrinkage when you compare the two. But again, I'm going to say one more time, we cannot make exact comparisons, but we can just kind of generally look, hey, yeah, there did look to see that there was a little bit more tumor volume shrinkage when you compare across the two. But the take-home message is really, well, gosh, nirogacestat is an amazing drug for some patients, and tumors shrank with both drugs, and both drugs did better than placebo. Now, we're also going to look at a question that some of you all had was looking at how did quality of life and symptoms and things like that change. So this is another super complicated slide, so my apologies in advance. But this is looking at change from baseline. This is kind of that zero line is kind of where we are at baseline. And these are some of the broad symptom measures that we looked at. And so the blue line is placebo in the varegacestat study. And so when we treated patients with placebo, their symptoms went up and down, but they pretty much stayed around the zero range. It didn't seem to change much when you treated patients with placebo. And kind of if we went up from the line, it was the symptoms are worsening. If we went down, the symptoms were improving. When you treated patients with varegacestat, you can see that, gosh, that that symptoms seem to improve down several points. Similarly, when we looked at nirogacestat, and again, there's some subtleties that make it difficult to compare, but you can see, well, gosh, similarly, compared to placebo, there was some improvement in symptom scores that we saw with nirogacestat. So a lot of patients felt better on nirogacestat. Now, if you look closely and you do your best to compare, you might think that, gosh, this happened a little bit early. Cycle 2 was at about 8 weeks, and that was about 8 weeks here. But to be honest with you, the measurements were taken at different time periods. So we didn't do as many measurements early on in one study versus the other. So that's another reason why it's a little bit difficult to compare. The range of points things went down was also a little bit different. But again, it's difficult to compare, and I'm going to put my disclosure back up as we cannot make exact comparisons here. So I think it's important for you to know, yes, symptoms improved with both drugs. Now, what about side effects? Let's look at this. And this is a slide that was used by Dr. Long, is another desmoid expert that he did a great job at our annual meeting where he compared kind of what we know about the drugs together in a very neutral way and made some of these indirect comparisons. And so we put the most common side effects that we run into with these gamma secretase inhibitors. And here, this is nirogacestat, and this is varegacestat. So any grade just means if anybody that had any level of a symptom, and again, that grade 3 is when it's kind of more severe. So you look at diarrhea. Well, gosh, similar numbers had, any level of diarrhea, and really similar had tougher diarrhea. Similar numbers had fatigue. We ran into maybe a little bit more rash was reported with varegacestat than nirogacestat. Maybe there was a little bit more nausea with nirogacestat. But I'll be honest with you guys, these are, even though these are some of the biggest studies we've ever had in desmoid tumors, they're relatively small studies. When we think about other types of studies that we do for cancer patients, we're using thousands of patients. And this is, in 70 patients, we saw some differences. So, but overall, the side effects were somewhat similar, although, there were some things, that we knew to look for a little bit more so when we were in the era of doing the varegacestat study as opposed to the nirogacestat study. So again, to summarize, the side effects were similar with varegacestat compared to nirogacestat. I will say that more patients had reduced doses on varegacestat versus nirogacestat. So the RINGSIDE study versus the DeFi study. Why is that? Well, I think there were things that we learned along the way as well. And we've learned that, gosh, reducing the doses, we can still have benefit from treating patients. So, it's possible that we might have reduced doses a little earlier, or it might be that the side effects were a little bit tougher. It's hard to know because it's hard to compare across studies. So, the next question you may have is, of course, how do I decide on next steps for me as a patient or for your loved one? And I have a few key things that I want you to remember. So, number one is I know this is confusing, but oh my gosh, this is truly amazing. We now have a number of new drugs for desmoid tumors that we never had before. When I started, and I will not admit how long I've been doing this for, we really didn't have any specific drugs. We were kind of borrowing, trying things, guessing, but now we have nirogacestat as the first drug approved specifically for desmoid tumors. And then we have varegacestat that has really promising activity, but very important to remember, it is not approved. So we do not have access to this drug right now. So if you're thinking, oh my gosh, how do I decide? Do I go on this one or do I go on that one? Well, gosh, right now we don't have a choice. Nirogacestat is the only drug that's approved. And as Katie did an amazing job of summarizing, gosh, they're looking for a drug approval, but we don't know when that will happen. The timeline and if there's going to be any specific requirements or how insurance would deal with it if it does get approved. So there's a lot of unknowns here. But what we do know is there's some promising activity. We also know that we have other targeted agents. So gosh, I spent a lot of time talking about gamma secretase inhibitors, but we've had other randomized studies kind of earlier on in desmoid tumors. So these are other targeted treatments that we've studied. So many of you may have heard of or even been on the medication sorafenib, which works in a different way. There was a study of placebo that was done. It's been almost 10 years now. There was also a study of pazopanib, another targeted treatment. We don't exactly know how these work in these tumors, but we do know that they work. And then that was compared to a gentle chemotherapy that we often have used for this disease as well. And so these were other randomized studies, and they also had tumor shrinkage rates. These ones were in the 30-some percent. But again, these are good drugs. And remember, if a drug helps you, it doesn't matter the statistics of how many people it's going to help or not. What matters is if it's going to help you or not. And same thing with side effects. It doesn't matter if it causes, severe diarrhea in you, or it doesn't matter if it causes severe diarrhea in 10%. It matters if it causes severe diarrhea in you. So we know that sorafenib and pazopanib are other drugs with activity in desmoid tumors. We also have chemotherapy as well that we haven't spent a lot of time with, but can be really important tools for patients with desmoid tumors. We also know that no size fits all in desmoid tumors. So we know that some treatments are better for some patients based on other factors that are individual to you or your tumor. So nobody can say this is the better drug or the best drug for everyone with desmoid tumors. We really think it's important for you to talk to your doctor, hopefully at a center with experience for desmoid tumors, and kind of really think through your individual situation. This is super important because, again, you are not going to treat anybody the same with this disease. Everybody is a conversation. Also, other things to not forget about. This is really a great thing. The more options we have for this disease, the more choices. There's definitely not something that works for everybody, and everyone has a different level of side effects. We also know that there's more exciting treatments coming. Many of you might have heard about a new drug, the FOG-001, which is another way to block this Wnt pathway now that you guys are experts on, hopefully, but is a new way to target this pathway. And there's other Wnt pathway inhibitors. We're also looking at other new local treatments that are available. So there's lots of exciting things coming, and we know that this disease can be tough. There's not a lot of information, not a lot of experts. So kind of to close, I wanted to remind you guys that you are not alone. It's good you guys are here together as a community. The Desmoid Tumor Research Foundation is there for you. Your providers are there for you. And I hope you do have a chance to network and chat and get to know each other in some ways, because there is comfort sometimes knowing, even though you're all different, that you're not alone. And so, with that, I want to thank you so much for coming online to listen, and to support yourself in this community, and to Katie and Pearl in the background for putting this together. So,
Thank you so much, Dr. Chug. What an important presentation, what important information you shared. I personally loved your summary blocks, so thank you for that. And overall, promising results from the Ringside trial. And as you noted, it's notable that we have treatment options for our rare disease. We have some great questions here. And gosh, I'm trying to decide where to start, but you just mentioned about the Wnt pathway, and there was this really interesting question about if GSIs. So again, GSIs are the gamma secretase inhibitors that Dr. Chug was just teaching us about, and the both nirogacestat and varegacestat are in that class. If the GSIs don't work they don't work for a particular patient, does that mean that it's the pathways are not the issue for that particular person in terms of why their tumor is growing? Is it a different issue? Does that make sense? I thought it was an interesting question and hopeful, if that's something that you've addressed before.
yeah, that is a great question. And, I think the best way to answer that is, gosh, this is complicated, right?
Uh-huh.
So there are things that we just don't understand yet. We know honestly a lot more about cancers than we do about desmoid tumors, just because there's a lot of investment in time and resources. And we know from cancers that, sometimes people have more than one genetic change, more than one pathway. And so if we just block them the same way, there's some tumors that just aren't going to behave the way we think they should. And why is that? What are the details behind it? We don't know. It could be anywhere from, gosh, there is a resistance change that develops so that the tumor figured out how
Mhm.
to outgrow the
Yeah.
treatment. It could be that sometimes what happens is the tumors are more in this kind of fibrotic state where they're in hibernation, but they're just not, and they're not active. So even though the tumor is there, it's not going to actively shrink,
Right.
particularly not actively growing. And sometimes there might be a problem with the drug getting into the tumor where we need it to,
Okay.
in kind of penetrating there. So there's a lot of different ways that, gosh, these drugs can't work, which is good, which is a good reason that we have options, other options to look for.
Right. I want to get to that in one moment because there's a couple questions that popped up when you were talking about other options. But in the Ringside study, here's a question. Do you know if they specifically tracked outcomes for those with those reduced doses to assess how dose reduction impacts tumor progression? So that's driving down a little bit more into that dose reduction question.
That's a great question. So I will tell you that in general, so there's a little bit more data since nirogacestat is has been around and has more time to flesh out the data, but preliminarily it's similar to with varegacestat that really it doesn't seem like the dose matters as much. We still get benefits. We do think that if we start at kind of the starting dose, that the benefit and symptoms and the depth of how much it shrinks,
Mhm.
it might be a little bit better.
Okay.
Um, but overall, patients that had to be dose reduced because of side effects and symptoms still had a similar level of benefit.
So, in a similar question, for patients who did have tumor shrinkage on varegacestat, did they have to stay on the medicine to keep it away, or were they able to go off the medicine? I'm not sure if that's part of the trial results that is able to be shared at this level, at this time, I mean.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And what we're learning so much about these.
Yeah.
we didn't know kind of even back with sorafenib and some of these earlier treatments, do we need to keep people on the treatment or can we stop them and still get benefit? And we're learning that a lot of times we can stop the medication and people can have continued benefit.
Hmm.
So that we saw it with nirogacestat. That's, we saw with varegacestat that we can stop. We're now, as data and time matures, we are being able to kind of quantitate that better. So I don't have
Right,
great data to tell you guys.
right.
I can tell you that yeah, we are seeing that when we stop the treatment, many patients have continued control of their treatment. We kind of turn the desmoid tumor into that active symptomatic state into that hibernation, quiescence.
Hmm. Okay, that's great. You touched on this, but just want to make sure that this question gets answered. What else is coming? What other trials are being done?
Yeah. So I think the one that a lot of people are excited about is that the FOG 001 study that I just
Mhm.
mentioned a little bit. And that's currently in development. It blocks this kind of different way to block the Wnt pathway. There's other kind of drugs in development that are targeting this pathway. But I'll be honest with you, and I think there was, from some of the insightful questions we've had, for some patients, it's not going to be all about blocking this pathway. We might need to have different kind of mechanisms
Okay.
of attack.
Yeah, so going back to that biology question about if a GSI wasn't working, does it have something to do with the pathway? Um, so I want to get into how do you advise or how do you work with your patients, Dr. Chug, knowing that a desmoid diagnosis requires a multidisciplinary team to look at it? So I'm asking this question in relation to a question that came up when you were talking about treatment options. We have a participant asking about high frequency ultrasound, sometimes called HIFU, as an option for treatment. And is there anything directly injectable into the tumors on the horizon? So we might be talking about doxorubicin embolization there, or maybe another process, cryoablation. So, can you speak a little bit about how you kind of coach your patients or how you work with your patients around looking at this panorama of options?
That's a great question because again, everybody's a little bit different. Everybody's tumor's in a different spot. And so, we usually talk about all our patients at our multidisciplinary tumor board where there are surgeons because occasionally it does make sense, even though we know in general we don't use surgery just because we know that can be, cause life long effects and not necessarily get rid of the tumor. But it is important that we have surgeons there, interventional radiologists who do ablation or do these other procedures like embolization,
Hmm.
where they block the blood supply. The problem with some of these other strategies is they aren't haven't been super well studied. They're usually kind of a collection of groups of patients that are treated with one way. Studies of these local treatments, which I think understandably people want to know about them. How can we do
Right.
this without being on medications that have side
Hmm.
effects that may or may not work? They're hard to conduct. A lot
Hmm.
of times, the way we get studies done, for better or worse, is because we have sponsors that are looking to get their drug approved. Because even though we have incredible partners in
Hmm.
kind of pushing desmoid tumors treatments forward, they're for most part for profit groups, pharmaceutical companies. So some of these treatments like cryoablation and things like that, there's no sponsor for that. So we
Yeah.
don't have great studies looking at, gosh, what if we do ablation versus not ablation? So we just kind
Hmm.
of have a hodgepodge collection. We talk about it at our tumor board saying, well, gosh, I think based on the appearance, the location, the size, this one might be one that would be good to consider cryoablation. But gosh, we don't have a study of
Mhm.
cryoablation versus nirogacestat versus sorafenib. It's a matter of kind of counseling, your patients and telling them about the risks and benefits. And I know it's overwhelming to
Mhm.
patients to kind of have to figure this out and listen to different specialists. But that's why I'm so grateful that so many of you guys are here to kind of,
Yeah.
learn more and, feel empowered about some of these tough decisions. And I'm so grateful. I see a lot of my own patients out there. So thank you guys for coming and your support. You guys
Yeah.
are, yeah.
And I think, there's a question that popped up that really has to do about quality of life. And whenever I'm having a conversation with one of our advisors or somebody that works with desmoid patients, I am always Mm, I'm overwhelmed with how much you do think about our quality of life, the people living with desmoid tumors and their caregivers. How are they getting along? And so I just want to appreciate you for that, and just want to, recognize clinicians in our community for that. So there's one question, kind of going back into some of the details. Do you anticipate that the GSIs will be able to be used repeatedly? Will patients be able to take breaks from treatment and then return to it if they see new tumor growth down the line? So I think a really interesting question, especially when we have a second, that we could potentially have a second approved drug on the horizon.
My answer to this one is going to be absolutely yes. I think that we have had patients that, are able to stop treatment and remain kind of with the tumor in a hibernation state where their symptoms have improved and they're doing well. Now, we don't have patients, decades out because the drugs just haven't been around that long.
Right.
So, but I will tell you, I feel like a lot of times, just based on past experiences from other drugs, even before GSIs, sometimes when we put those tumors into hibernation, however we do it, sometimes they stay in hibernation and we don't need to retreat. Other tumors are peskier and they just don't want to be quiet. They want to just keep waking up.
Yeah.
And
Right.
definitely, I think we can go back to these treatments and try them again. There's a little bit more experience. I've done that a lot with sorafenib, but again,
Okay.
size haven't been around for long enough to kind of have to know, you know, have a ton of patients that we retreated with them
Got
because
it. That makes
they,
sense.
there
Yeah.
hasn't been a ton of patients we've needed to retreat. Yes, there
Right.
yet.
Right. There's a couple questions, and I just want to make sure to respect our participants, and a couple questions about, for example, have changes at the FDA affected desmoid research? Questions about access and cost of medical treatments, and those are a little bit outside of the scope of our call today. But I do want to just make sure to say that we are paying attention. We know that these are important questions and important topics for our community, and so we will do our very best to respond appropriately and to the extent that we are able to. Um, I want to just say thank you so much, Dr. Chug, for this really important presentation and information and conversation. One of my biggest takeaways is that I think what I hear you saying is that you being the patients and caregivers out there, are an active member of your care team. Am I getting that correct? As a clinician, you feel that way, it seems to me. And that I'm hopeful that this conversation and hearing from Dr. Chug can give patients and caregivers permission to be that actively involved member of their team, to work collaboratively with their healthcare providers. And like you said, sometimes that's it's always a medical oncologist, but you're going to have sometimes an interventional radiologist. You're going to have perhaps a surgeon, other folks involved in there, and then there's all the other referrals. We're hopeful that people are paying attention to mental health and asking for support if they need, and not waiting, but knowing that that's an active part of their treatment plan as well. So again, one of my takeaways is that you all can be and should be and and have permission to be active members of your own care team, and working with your providers to make decisions that align with both your goals and your values. So hopefully that's a takeaway for others today as well. Um, I do want to, before we close out today, I just want to make sure to say thank you once again to our sponsor of this webinar, Immunome Inc. And we have a couple ways that we would love for you to stay connected. So the DTRF continuously hosts events like this, like Rashmi was saying. Part of the importance is being connected as a community. So we try to do that in lots of different ways. We have an upcoming event at the end of this month called In Her Own Words, Amanda's Story for Sarcoma Awareness Month. So someone from our community that's going to tell her story about living with a desmoid tumor as well as being a survivor of Ewing sarcoma. We also have it's not listed here, but on September 1st, please mark your calendars. That's our kickoff of Desmoid Tumor Awareness Month. And we will have a special community gathering to hear from other folks in our community, to give you an opportunity to connect with other folks living with desmoid tumors and caregivers of folks living with desmoid tumors. And please consider joining us for our signature event of the year, which is the Together We Will weekend, this year taking place in Philadelphia, September 25th to 27th. So registration for everything that I'm talking about is available at dtrf.org. So always have to make a reminder here that we're talking about advancing research and working together as a community to do that. And so the DTRF is a nonprofit organization, and it is your energy, your experience, and your contributions that really do fuel our work and our progress. So a couple ways to be involved, just a couple, there's lots others. We do have a volunteer program called the DTRF Ambassadors. And this is for patients and caregivers who are interested in taking a deeper dive into driving awareness, building community, and accelerating research. Our door is always open for donations. Your gifts go directly to supporting more educational program like this. And very important to note that the DTRF does have our own fund for research grants. Every contribution you make goes directly towards this. Every contribution, no matter what amount, matters and does make a difference. So again, you can find more information about this. We also encourage, if you're not already signed up for our newsletter, to do so at dtrf.org. Okay, so I see Rashmi saying hello to you all in the chat, and thanks everybody for your kind words in the chat. Again, if we didn't get to all of your questions, know that we will do our very best to follow up with you. And I would once again like to extend a huge gratitude to our presenter, Dr. Rashmi Chugh, for being with us today. Rashmi, thank you for your dedication to the desmoid community, and please keep going. Our vision at the DTRF, as you know, is to find a cure for each and every person living with a desmoid tumor, and it truly is clinician researchers like you that are moving us closer to that every day. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention all of you. Thank you for being here. I want to say a huge thank you to our community for being with us today and being attentive to all of the DTRF's work and offerings. Please keep talking about our rare disease. Continue to share accurate resources, like the information that you learned today from the RINGSIDE trial results. Please keep engaging with DTRF content and helping us to raise awareness wherever conversations about desmoid tumors happen. And just a reminder that the recording of this webinar will be available shortly and posted on our video library. Thank you so much for being a part of the DTRF. Wishing you all a peaceful evening. Take care.